So I'd like to take us out a little bit of the world of historical facts and figures and dates and move a little bit to the soundtrack of the era. In part because I really love the music, and in part because when we talk about the history, we're often caught in what people are thinking, what they're arguing about, what they're aspiring to politically. And we don't have a way to tune into what they were seeking spiritually, what was uplifting them, how that was expressed in the music. And specifically, I'm talking about the music of Salomon Sulzer and the music of Louis Lewandowski. Both of them grew up in the early part of the 1800s, and in their lives, they began to write Jewish music for the synagogue, for choir, and for organ, or to take traditional melodies and harmonize them for choir and set them for orchestra or for organ. And in the process, they changed how we imagine Jewish music to be, and their impact was huge, and we use so many of their melodies still not even aware that they came out of that context. We sing many of them at our little synagogues of people who don't necessarily come from a Reformed background. We sing them in unison, and we don't know that they actually came from a place where they were harmonized and orchestrated, and the sound of them filled these immense spaces with vaulted ceilings and were sung to German-speaking people. So I'll tell you a little bit about these composers, but first let's hear some of the music. Let's imagine that it's a Friday evening and you go to synagogue in Berlin at the Neue Synagogue on Oranienburger Straße. And you're dressed in your finest, and so is everyone else. And the chazan steps up, and the choir stands, all in robes. And the congregation stands as well. And together, this is how Shabbat is welcomed. I love that Lecha Dodi. It could have been really simple, right? It could have just been Lecha Dodi Likrat Kala. Simple like that, but instead has these suspensions, these places where one note gets left behind and then has to catch up because it's like it's so sweet it doesn't want to let go. So it's like this. Lecha Dodi. Here's the first suspension. And here's the second. Anyway, there you are at the Neue Synagogue in Berlin, and it's Erev Shabbat, and so the Chazan and the choir move on to Psalm 92, Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbat. And it's big and it's grand and it's more than you could sing along. You can't sing along on this. You're sitting and you're listening and you're being like you're in a concert hall. And the cantor is singing sort of a recitative. He's sort of singing a section where the words are just set to very simple music for the chazan alone. And then it gives way to the choir for the last bit of the psalm. And there's the part that sounds like angels singing, and the part that you can sing along with. Before the evening is out, before the synagogue ritual is over, the chazan will lift up a glass and sing a kiddush that we continue to use now. And it is also by Louis Lewandowski. So we should say a little bit about Lewandowski. He was born in the 1820s, and he studied piano and voice in Berlin. And later he studied composition at the Berlin Academy. He was the first Jew admitted to that program, which was ironic because he was admitted at the insistence of Felix Mendelssohn. In 1840, at the age of 19, he was appointed to be the choir master at the Berlin Synagogue. There he began writing new music for the synagogue service. Later on in 1866, and 26 years later, he was asked to be the first choir master of the Neue Synagogue, which was on Oranienburger Straße, the facade of which still stands in Berlin, in the Mitte neighborhood. This was the neighborhood that my great-grandparents lived in. My great-great-grandfather was some assistant rabbi or something at that synagogue during Lewandowski's tenure. Anyway, Lewandowski was the choir master there for the rest of his life. you'll probably hear more of Salomon Sulzer in Shabbat morning. Sulzer was Lewandowski's senior by 20 years. He was born in 1804 in Austria. And as a young man, he studied for the cantorate with a bunch of famous chazanim of the time. And when he was just 16 years old, in 1820, just 2 years after the Hamburg synagogue released its Sidur, its Gebetbuch, Sulzer was appointed cantor at the synagogue in the town that he grew up in Hohenems, and there he modernized the ritual and he installed a choir. And then just 6 years later, he was called to Vienna to be the chief cantor there. And he retained many of the traditional melodies, but he harmonized them for choir according to the style of the day. So some of his music is music that we continue to sing week after week, sometimes day after day. And here are some examples. For instance, this. After a big, wild organ solo and then a grand piece of music in German called Aus himmlischen Munde, all of a sudden it unfolds back into this familiar Hebrew. Sulzer gives us some of the most common responses in the liturgy. For instance, his is the Baruch Hu et Adonai Hamevorach, Baruch Adonai Hamevorach Le'olam Vaed. Also, many elements of the Torah service come from Sulzer. People sometimes ask, isn't this music just copied from non-Jewish culture? And the answer is yes, it is. Or maybe not copied, but in dialogue. If you look at every Jewish community in history, that's been the case. Klezmer music sounds like Roma music. Salomone Rossi's motets sound like Italian motets. Sephardic music sounds Spanish. Mizrahi music sounds Arab. We've never been impermeable to our environments. The ideas of the day, the flavors, the music, even ghetto walls couldn't keep them out. They are a piece of our evolution. So the question then is such change authentic? And there might be two views on how to answer that question. From an ultra-Orthodox standpoint, change is always a deviation. Change is always about being pulled away from some true path. But from any other standpoint, change is the path, not the detour. The world around us changed and invited us to change with it. So as long as we imbue it with our Jewish hearts, our neshamas, our minds, and our deepest Jewish intentions, as long as our prayers carry our heartfelt Jewish cries and our words of praise to God's ears, then yes, it is authentic. And that's what makes this music so Jewish. Even though to a certain ear you might say it sounds like a concert hall or even a church, from inside the system of that change, it is so, so Jewish and so glorious. Hallelujah.